Okay, so this is the continuation of a series of video lectures recapping Sarah Ahmed's Queer Phenomenology, Chapter 1. This is the fourth video in that series. We're picking up on page 48 with Heidegger. We're talking about how the broken hammer becomes perceivable by us as an object in itself rather than an object that refers beyond itself to an action to be performed. Quote, what is being revealed when technologies are no longer ready for action? For Heidegger, it is properties that are revealed. And Ahmed also states, the failure of things to be put to use does not mean an access to properties of things that are independent of their use. So here we're talking about, in the same way that one of Ahmed's theses throughout the book is that in order to orient ourselves, we have to become disoriented. Here she's picking up on a point in Heidegger in which he's saying that the broken tool, in a way, gives us more, or rather a different way of accessing its properties and a different way of perceiving it fundamentally than a tool that we are looking at for the explicit purpose of performing an action with that tool. So 49, failures of extension don't inhere in the object, and this is the idea of blaming the tool. The experience of this non-extension might then lead to the object being attributed with properties, qualities, and values. So after this, we return, as we have before and we will again many times, to the table. The matter and form of the table are dependent on the histories of labor, which are congealed in and as the very thing of the table. The table is an effect of work, and it also points to work in the very form that it takes. Different tables have different functions. We do things with them by performing actions upon them. And the example that Ahmed gives for this is how the form of the writing table and the form of something like a coffee table differ as an effect of the work that they are designed for. And then she moves again into riffing etymologically on the roots of the word table. On page 50, we are thinking about the question of fit. The example of the hammer that is too heavy or the table that is too high shows us how the position of the object, and indeed the qualities perceived in an object as given, refer us to the relations between objects and the subjects that make use of them. So here it's neither just the subject or just the object, but the fit is something that happens in the dialogue between person and thing. And so 51, this leads Ahmed to offer one definition of orientation as adjustment. We know where we are through how we position ourselves in relation to others. And the failure of work then is not in the thing or in the person, but rather is about whether the person and the thing face each other in the right way. Bodies and their objects tend toward each other. They are orientated toward each other and are shaped by this orientation. And then she introduces this very interesting idea of failed orientation, which has me thinking about, she doesn't take it too far in any direction after bringing it up, but I'm thinking about the idea of mass production and the standardization of clothes or furniture or other goods in such a way that it assumes a certain body type or a certain range of body types. And what, the implications of this sort of standardization for the idea of fit, and the implications that has for where we move the slider intuitively or societally between where we're placing the blame when there is a failed orientation. And here we move into the section inhabiting spaces, where Ahmed broaches the question, how do bodies matter in what objects do? And the idea of disappearance shows up again, as it will time and again for Ahmed. So the philosopher faces these objects more than others in the labor of doing philosophy, even if the approach taken makes the object disappear. And also, the nearness of certain objects is an effect of the work the body does, and the work the body does is what makes certain objects near. Um, but again, as we've been shown throughout, and will continue to be shown by Ahmed, sometimes it's the very nearness of objects, or objects that are the most ready to hand to us, the ones that we use most frequently, that are the least perceivable in the full range of their thingness. And similarly, the labor that goes into the objects that we use is also invisibilized. So there are many things that are suppressed when we turn towards the objects that we use to do work. So she gets into talking about Lefebvre and Merleau-Ponty here. On page 53, Merleau-Ponty, the body is not just another thing. Our body is not in space like things. It inhabits or haunts space. It implies itself to space like a hand to an instrument, and when we wish to move about, we do not move the body as we move an object. And Merleau-Ponty suggests that the body is not itself a container, but a form of expression, a making visible of our intentions. Space is not a container for the body. Rather, bodies are submerged. And I really want to pick out some of the interesting verbs that Ahmed uses here, or that other writers here are using in a way that Ahmed picks up on. For instance, in the way that the histories of labor and the demands of labor congeal in an object from a couple of pages ago. And then on this page, the idea that a body, our bodies, haunt space. And that we're not simply in space, but that we're submerged in it. And Ahmed really leaves it up to us, the task of figuring out what it means. I mean, I think I have an intuitive sense of it, but this is another thing I'd love to talk about when we meet. What does it mean to simply be in space like an object versus to haunt space or be submerged in it as a subject? So she turns here to volume 2 of Husserl's Ideas, and to the lived body, or rather, I should say, in this volume of Ideas, Husserl turns to the lived body and to the intimacy of touch. And so, this brings in the question of, we get one table when we're looking at it, but when we reach out to experience the table with the faculty of touch, we encounter a wholly different table. And Husserl becomes fascinated with this idea. Page 54, Ahmed follows how Husserl notices that bodies are something touching which is touched. And she brings in Rosalind Dyprose's idea of the interworld or the open circuit. I think these are also very generative terms, the idea that we, along with each other and other entities that are present in space, are worlding together as we touch each other. We perceive the object, as something that has integrity and is in space only by haunting that very space. That is, by co-inhabiting space such that the boundary between the co-inhabitants of space does not hold. Again, this idea of haunting and troubling the idea of the discrete body. So there's this intuitive sense of my body as sovereign, separate, sealed, and the kind of body that we're encountering here has fuzzy borders, leaky borders. There's a porosity and exchange and reciprocity with other beings and other entities. We, in approaching this or that table, are also approached by the table, which touches us when we touch it. Um, Bodies as well as objects take shape through being orientated toward each other as an orientation that may be experienced as the cohabitation or sharing of space. Um, and this may seem like something obvious, of course. If we're in space together, we're sharing space. But I think if we've been following the arc of Ahmed's arguments and the arcs that she's following in other writers, there's something a little bit more in this concept of sharing space than simply co-presence. 55, the horizon is what is around as the body does its work. The bodily horizon shows what bodies can reach toward by establishing a line beyond which they cannot reach. The horizon marks the edge of what can be reached by the body. The body becomes present as a body with surfaces and boundaries and showing the limits of what it can do. So here Ahmed's following the other side of this argument. You know, she's taken us towards the porosity of bodies, and now she's taking us towards a little bit towards their edges. And there's also this incredible line in here: the history of bodies can be rewritten as the history of the reachable. And obviously, because Ahmed loves wordplay, it's not simply what's within reach. Like there's a book on this table and I can pick it up because it's within reach of my arm, but also, you know, what jobs, what possibilities, what life worlds are open to us as an expression of our reach. And that reach is an expression of work, history, our access. You get what I'm saying. 56, orientations are about the direction we take that puts some things and not others in our reach. Phenomenology helps us to explore how bodies are shaped by histories which they perform in their comportment, their posture, and their gestures. So we have this important term, the bodily horizon, that shows up first on page 55. And a couple of synonyms for this are introduced. Some people call it the bodily horizon. Some people call it sedimented history. Pierre Bourdieu, who's brought in here, calls it the habitus. For Judith Butler, it is precisely how phenomenology exposes the sedimentation of history in the repetition of bodily action that makes it a useful resource for feminism. And what bodies tend to do are effects of histories rather than being originary. We could say that history happens in the very repetition of gestures. So repetition can make something effortless, causing it to disappear. It is important that we think not only about what is repeated, but also about how the repetition of actions takes us in certain directions. We are also orientating ourselves towards some objects more than others, including not only physical objects, but also objects of thought, feeling, and judgment, as well as objects in the sense of aims, aspirations, and objectives. And this is, of course, Ahmed has a more condensed way of what I was trying to say earlier, which is, our orientation towards objects can be thought of in a wide range of types of objects. And she gives the example of the writer here. 57, we get the writer's sore body. Very, very relatable for me. I write, and in performing this work, I might yet become my object, become a writer with a writer's body and a writer's tendencies. The sore neck, the sore shoulders are sure signs of having done this work. And she talks about repetitive stress injury, the lump on her finger that she develops. This is so endlessly interesting to me because I feel like everyone has, but just thinking personally, I have these histories in my own body. This lump in her finger made me think of when I was working in a kitchen back when I lived in Austin, and I got a splinter from a giant soup spoon stuck around my joint and developed this weird lump that lasted for years, which is always what I go to when I'm thinking about how these histories accrue in our bodies. Anyway, we get stuck in certain alignments as an effect of this work. The work of repetition is not neutral work. It orients the body in some ways rather than others. 58, on the nearness of objects, Ahmed says, "It is not just that I find them there like that. Rather, the nearness of such objects is a sign of an orientation I have already taken toward the world as an orientation that shapes what we call inadequately character." So again, Ahmed, following to a certain extent Judith Butler's idea of the performative, the iterative, the accruing of repetitions. Ahmed's thinking about how these small acts of choice, these small acts of gathering certain objects rather than others, of pursuing certain objects in the sense of aims or objectives, of being steered into them by the various forces of our lives, how these set us up to have a certain range of objects available to us, both in the sense of like if I'm being steered, or if I have steered myself continually towards writing, I have the tools of writing close at hand, and that's no accident. That's a function of that history. So let's see. If spaces extend bodies, then we could say that spaces also extend the shape of the bodies that tend to inhabit them. Let's see. So she's thinking about this in terms of gender. And there's a funny little link from a TV show that I'm going to share. Maybe I'll pop it right here if I can figure out how to do that. Gender becomes naturalized as a property of bodies, objects, and spaces, partly through the loop of this repetition, which leads bodies in some directions more than others, as if that direction came from within the body, and explains which way it turns. And so, approaching the end of the chapter here, 59, what we do on the table is also about being given a place within a familiar order. Bodies are shaped by the work they do on the table, where work involves gendered forms of occupation. And as an example, Ahmed brings in Charlotte Perkin Gilman's work on the home, famous for her utopian novel Herland and The Yellow Wallpaper. Such forms of occupation or being occupied shape the furniture. This is Gilman. The chairs become soft to provide seating for the body that sits. In turn, the body becomes soft as it occupies the soft seat, taking up the space made available by the seat. Such positions become habitual. They are repeated, and in being repeated, they shape the body and what it can do. The more the body sits, the more it tends to be seated. What we do affects what we can do. So I think this is a very succinct way of putting that. The things we habitually do shape the range of what we're able to do. 60, gender could thus be described as a bodily orientation. And then this is where Ahmed reaches also for Iris Marion Young. Young argues that gender differences are differences in orientation. In other words, even if what we do affects what we can do, other things remain possible. And this is a very hopeful note for me. For instance, bodies can take up spaces that do not extend their shape, which can in turn work to reorientate bodies in space. Failed orientations as the queer effect of oblique or diagonal lines created by bodies out of place. And her example for this is when women write and when women philosophize, which Ahmed says isn't as queer a phenomenon as it used to be, but it still expresses the sort of slantness or obliquity or diagonality that she's talking about. And again, she brings in as one of her archetypes of the woman as philosopher, Virginia Woolf. Let's see. So what happens when the woman as philosopher takes up her pen? What happens when the study is not reproduced as a masculine domain by the collective repetition of such moments of deviation? She talks about the known feminist press, Kitchen Table Press, which, whose name is no accident. To use the table that supports domestic work to do political work is a reorientation device. And this is an important term. 62, Iris Marion Young again on female body experience and feminist tables. There's the reminder here that the woman philosopher still has to arrive. It takes time, this arrival into the scene of writing, just as it takes time and work to keep one's attention on the writing table. And this is a callback to the passage that Ahmed cited earlier from Adrienne Rich on being pulled away from the writing table by her kiddo. Indeed, for bodies to arrive in spaces where they are not already at home, where they are not in place, requires hard work. Indeed, it involves painstaking labor for bodies to inhabit spaces that do not extend their shape. Having arrived, such bodies in turn might acquire new shapes, and spaces in turn acquire new bodies. This passage on 62 is one of the most interesting passages to me personally. It has me thinking about many things, but especially my own experience at the University of Massachusetts, and the way that I felt like I was invited in as a body, as a trans body that it isn't, that the space isn't designed for, and how I had to navigate that space. A space where there wasn't really, it wasn't really designed for my body, and the fact that the university didn't really exert any labor on its behalf forced the labor of changing the space onto me, onto the person who isn't at home. That's just a personal example. There are better examples, but it's really, I'm thinking a lot about that. And it pushed back on the shape that I was coming in with. Anyway, 63, our task is to recall their histories of arrival and how this history opens up spaces for others that have yet to be cleared. And then, we return to disappearance and hiddenness from view. Does Husserl's gaze avoid wandering there? And the there Ahmed's talking about is back there in the background. Insofar as those spaces are shaped by concealed labor, as the labor that gives him the capacity to think about the writing table. In a way, a queer phenomenology is involved in the project of turning the tables on phenomenology by turning toward other kinds of tables. And this recalls to me the emphasis on wandering from page 29, where, just to bring that back, wandering can mean to ramble without course, to go aimlessly, to take one direction without intention or control, to stray from a path, or even to deviate in conduct or belief. So, this is where the chapter ends for us, and in this turn towards the possibility of straying or deviating, perhaps even intentionally, perhaps even embracing deviation as a political tool, really sets us up for chapter 2. But this is the end of the fourth video for chapter 1, and the end of my little recap of chapter 1. And the next set of videos will be for chapter 2, sexual orientation. Thank you.